I'm just so honored and privileged to introduce Betty Soskin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, hello. Let's see. When I first came into the parks, I actually, I guess where I want to start is with a film. You can imagine the kind of challenge that would have been faced by our filmmakers when they were asked to do the orientation film for our park, which represented probably the greatest mobilization of workers since the building of the pyramids of the Great Wall of China. This was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's great arsenal of democracy. And every man, woman, and child in the country was involved in some capacity. They say it took 7 people at home to support each life on the home front, on the battlefields. So our filmmakers, though consigned to coming up with a 15 or 20-minute film, decided for us that they would not do that. What they did was they did 2 complete films, one 24 minutes, that tells the story of the national effort across the country, because of course we're not a local park, we're a national park. And that film is called The War at Home, and it's a 24-minute film. And then they did a number of fragments of films, because there were so many aspects to that homefront story that there was no way to deal with it. There was the story of 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans interned, lost 2.5 years of their lives and much of their treasure. Story of African American migration out of the southern states. A story of women's emancipation into non-traditional labor for the very first time. Story of that great explosion at Port Chicago, which vaporized 2 Kaiser ships to the loss of 320 men, 202 of them being black dock workers. There were so many stories, so that they did fragments of films that we could use as conversation starters. But the one that I use, because I'm in the theater 3 to 5 times a week, and I'm there using a film that limits itself to telling just what happened in the city of Richmond, because that's the only part of the story that I can talk about in any kind of authority, because that's the history that I lived. I was a 20-year-old clerk working in a Jim Crow segregated union hall in the middle of Richmond. And the story that this film tells, is about that city during those years of 1942 to 1945. So after the film is over, I'll put my life in the context of that history for you. As the credits roll, you're going to find my name among the consultants to the filmmakers. Of course, the reason that that list is so long is because everybody on the staff was a consultant of the filmmakers. And not only that, but I didn't have any idea what a consultant to a filmmaker was, or did. So there was no way for me to get a sense of what this finished product was going to be. All I knew was over a 2.5 or 3 year period, every now and then we'd get a block of text to be wordsmithed, or we'd get stills from the Library of Congress or the National Archives, and I'd say, okay, but I was really in over my head. I had no idea what this finished product was going to be. And when it was finally released to us, just before the opening of the visitor center, and I saw it for the first time, it may interest you to know that I was disappointed. I didn't like it at all. Partly because the history as I had lived it was nowhere in sight. I was really here. I was here as a 20-year-old clerk working in a Jim Crow segregated union hall somewhere in the middle of Richmond in a temporary building, because the unions, the labor movement, wasn't yet racially integrated, and wouldn't be for another decade. So that in order to comply with the wishes of Kaiser, the unions had created auxiliaries, which was a fancy name for Jim Crow. There was one at Marin Ship at Sausalito, there was another in West Oakland, there was a third in Richmond, and that was Boilermakers Auxiliary 36, and that's where I spent my days. If you had asked me, I'd have told you that at the time that all the shipyard workers were black. because the only people I saw were the people who came to my window to get their addresses changed on 3x5 card cards, which is what I was doing to save the world for democracy. And as you can see, it worked. But I was nowhere near the shoreline, nowhere near a shipyard. Never saw a ship under construction, nor did I ever see a ship being launched. That entire history had been lost to me. Came in every day in a carpool home, went home every night, having no sense of that bigger picture at all. But if you'd known me 2 years before then, you'd have known little Betty Charbonnet, who was a little Cajun Creole child who'd come out from New Orleans in 1927. That was the year that the city fathers in New Orleans had chosen to bomb the levees against the rising Mississippi to save St. Charles Avenue and the Garden District. And they sacrificed the 7th and 9th wards and the Treme, which was our ancestral home. And that year my mother had arrived at 6th Street Station in Oakland with 3 little girls and everything we had left in a couple of cardboard suitcases to join Papa George Allen. This was her father. He had already come. He was out here since the First World War. I was working as a waiter in downtown Oakland on Clay Street and living on 76th Avenue in a little shotgun bungalow that was shared with my mother's 2 brothers and a sister, and Aunt Louise, who was his 3rd wife that we were no longer calling grandmother. She was Aunt Louise. And we would wait there for my father, who would join us in a couple of months when things were settled in New Orleans. And I would spend my childhood and my adolescence in Oakland, East Oakland, as a child of the service workers' generation. Our fathers and our uncles were the red caps and the Pullman porters and the waiters and the cooks and the janitors and the laborers. Our mothers were 50 cents an hour domestic servants, taking care of white people's children and white people's homes, because that's who we were as a nation in those years. I graduated from Castlemont High School with only 2 opportunities for employment open to me. I could have worked in agriculture, or I could have worked as a domestic servant. My older sister Marjorie, who was a beautiful young woman and a talented artist incidentally, spent the first 5 years of her marriage as half of a domestic team. Her young husband was the chauffeur, and Marjorie was the housekeeper for a family in Piedmont. And by living in on the premises with Thursdays off, which was traditional, they could save every penny they earned toward the down payment on their first home. And this was a traditional pathway into the middle class for African Americans. This is what my life would have been. This was the prescription. Except that there was a 3rd choice, and it was the one I was wise enough to take. I married Mel Reid, whose family had made their way out from Griffin, Georgia, at the first cannon shots of the Civil War. And Mel, his father, and his grandmother were all born in Berkeley General Hospital. And in 1942, Mel was in his senior year at the University of San Francisco, playing left halfback for the San Francisco Dons. And what 19-year-old wouldn't prefer that? Which is what I did. So I escaped the life that my sister had lived. But I share that history with you in order to illustrate that being a clerk, even in a Jim Crow segregated union hall in 1942, was a step up. My folks were proud of me. I was being a clerk. I wasn't taking care of white people's homes or white people's children. I was a clerk, which in 1942 would have been the equivalent of today's young woman of color being the first in her family to enter college, because that's who we were as a nation back in those years. Now, scroll ahead with me to 15 years ago. And 15 years ago, I'm back in Richmond, back after over 20 years as a suburban housewife, after raising 4 children to adulthood, after outliving 2 husbands, And after lots and lots of decades of learning lots of lessons, and now, by 15 years ago, I'm pretty sophisticated. And I'm back in Richmond this time as a field representative for a member of the California State Assembly. I'm working with Dion Aaroner. And when Dion term limited out, I stayed on as a field representative for her successor, Lonnie Hancock, who's only now term limiting out of the California State Senate. I'm in a one-person satellite office in Richmond. I'm doing constituency work. And with the rest of field staff, I'm helping to determine what kind of legislation might be needed of the 5 cities of West Contra Costa County over which my office sat. And if you're wondering whether I became a genius between the time I was 20 and 15 years ago, may I quickly assure you that that's anything but true? This was not a case of personal achievement, not for 1 minute. Nor is it a case of black history to be remembered as such. That arc of my life from 20 to 15 years ago illustrates how much social change occurred in this nation over those intervening years. And that's something that we all did, all of us. Black and brown and yellow and straight and gay and trans. It's what we all did, all of us. All of us. Some of us did it kicking and screaming. And some of us are still kicking and screaming. And all of us didn't get there at the same time. Not by a long shot. But enough of us completed that complete arc that my life so well represents, so that to this day, social change initiated in those years between 1942 and 1945, that acceleration of social change continues to radiate out of the Bay Area into the rest of the nation, which is enough to build a park around. Now, didn't mean that we all got there together or that some of us didn't freeze in place. A lot of us froze on issues. Open housing took a lot of folks not ready to have their families living with a family that didn't look just like theirs right next door. No, what about property values? And then more of us peeled off on the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. You know, why should my children be bused across town to suit your social agenda? And then more of us, either because they had forgotten or had never known that it took $47.25 a week to support a family of 5 if you were white. Remember, our fathers and our uncles were all members of the service workers generation, and they earned $25 to $35 a week. Pullman porters earned $18 a week plus tips. And that's what initiated the first thoughts of affirmative action. It was never a case of quotas. This is what we're doing. Now, long about 1970, maybe just before that, there began to rise in the Department of Interior and in the National Park Service a sensitivity to the fact that though every single taxpayer in the country was funding the creation, the development, and the maintenance of this incredible system of national parks, it was only the people with the leisure time and the financial resources who could afford to visit them. Only that. And they began to see the need for urban parks, taking parks to the people. And in the city of Richmond had come into being one of those urban parks. And the planners were gathered here to determine the shape of that park, because each of them was made of whole cloth. Each of them had to be designed without patterns to go by. This park had been created, legislation carried by George Miller, supported by Dianne Feinstein and Barbara Boxer, had come into being defined by scattered sites that lay throughout the city of Richmond. Sites that we either own privately, commercially, by nonprofits, civically. We would own nothing. How do you create a park without any federal lands? And that's what we were being asked to do. How do you create a national park that doesn't have any boundaries? The only one that vaguely resembled it may have been the one in Lowell, Massachusetts, but in that case, the federal government had gone in, purchased the textile mills, transformed them into arts and cultural centers, and over time, the entire city of Lowell, Massachusetts became a national park. That's one model. And here were the planners gathered here in my district, in an area where I was not even aware of a national park, though my office, that little satellite office, was less than a mile from the Rosie Memorial, but it had not occurred to me to ever connect, to visit the Rosie Memorial, because that was a white woman's story. The women in my family had been working outside their homes since slavery because it had always taken 2 wages to support black families. So I didn't see any relationship. That was a white woman's story. But when the community meetings began to be organized, because those owners of those properties had to be met with, the community had to be met with, to make those decisions along with the planners of what shape this park was going to take. And this was when I met the national parks, based on my first PowerPoint, where I saw for the first time that incredible, incredible building, the Ford Assembly Plant, that was designed by Albert Kahn, built between the years of 1929 and 1931 to assemble Model A Fords. It was taken over during the war and turned out thousands and thousands of tanks and jeeps for the war in the Pacific. But that building had been constructed on state-owned land, built on air rights, one of the earliest that used that concept. And I'm the only one in the room that represented the state and therefore incorporated, at first informally as a consultant, but I'm the only person of color in the room and the only person who can look at the PowerPoint and instantly see them as sites of racial segregation, because what gets remembered is determined by who's in the room during the remembering. There was no grand conspiracy to leave my history out. There simply wasn't anybody in that room who had any reason to know that. And fortunately for all of us, all of those planners were graduates of Sesame Street. And in my pantheon of civil rights leaders, there had always been a place for Jim Henson and his children's television workshop, and Mr. Rogers, because they spent several decades humanizing America's children. And by 15 years ago, those kids were all grown up. And by then, they're sitting around corporate boardrooms throughout the country. They're in the Forestry Service. They're in the State Department. They're in the National Park Service, Department of Interior. And now they're in Microsoft and Apple and Google. And they all knew that it wasn't easy being green. And they knew that one of these things is not like the other, and it doesn't matter one bit. And they were not only willing, but anxious to know what was missing in their PowerPoint. And for the first time since I was that 20-year-old clerk working in that Jim Crow segregated union hall. I'm in a position to learn the rest of the story. And it was a marriage made to heaven. I read everything I could about Mr. Kaiser. The studies were just beginning to come out. The doctoral theses and the master's papers were just beginning to come out. The University of California, Dr. Squivik, Professor Litvak, Margaret Archibald, they were just beginning to come out and available to us, and I could, for the first time, learn about Mr. Henry Kaiser, and immediately fell in love. I mean, here was a man who had dropped out of school at the age of 13, only had an 8th grade education, came into Richmond as a cement contractor who had never built a ship, had to go to the library to find out how you do that. As a man who had such confidence in himself that he knew that if he simply introduced the mass production techniques that Henry Ford was using in auto manufacturing, that he could revolutionize shipbuilding. All he needed was enough hands. And he didn't care what color they were, and he didn't care who they were attached to. He just needed enough hands. And nothing I ever read about him would have suggested to me that he was a social reformer, not by any long shot. He was simply a smart industrialist. He knew not only that, but he knew where the greatest pool of available labor existed in this country, in the 5 southern states of Mississippi, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana. Whites coming off the Dust Bowl, blacks recovering from the slow mechanization of cotton, everybody bouncing from the Great Depression of the 30s, possible for a black man to be standing on the sidewalk in Jackson, Mississippi, where Southern tradition would demand that he step off into the gutter if a white person approached, and that man could be tapped on the shoulder by a Kaiser recruiter and find himself 2 weeks later in the city of Richmond, riding in the front of the bus, 10 years before Rosa Parks would refuse to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama. Into a city with a population of 23,000. Only Henry Kaiser would have the audacity to bring in a workforce of 98,000 black and white Southerners who are not going to be sharing drinking fountains, schools, hospitals, housing, any kind of public accommodations for another 20 years back in their places of origin. That's not going to happen until the 60s. We're talking 1942. And there's no time for focus groups and diversity training. They've got to cut it. They've got to negotiate at the individual level every day in order to get through it without killing each other. These are black and white Southerners. And because they're all living under the common threat of fascist world domination, there's no time to take on a broken social system. No time to do anything except take on the mission of their leader, which is pure and simple: build ships faster than the enemy can sink them. And together, behind a man who referred to the bow of the ship as the pointy end, you gotta love Mr. Kaiser. They completed 747 ships in 3 years and 8 months. 747 ships. By way of comparison, Mr. Moore at Moore Dry Dock, who's a traditional shipbuilder, been building ships since the First World War, Mr. Moore completed 100. Bechtel Corporation completed 93 at Marin Ship. And Henry Kaiser and his merry band of sharecroppers completed 747 ships. And right here in San Francisco Bay, outside of Richmond, they helped to turn the course of the war around by outproducing the enemy. And in the process, they accelerated the rate of social change so that to this day it still radiates out of the Bay Area into the rest of the nation. This is still where the visionaries come to find constituencies for their wildest dreams. because of what happened right here. That's rather amazing. They say if you dropped a quarter on the deck at that time, it would be welded into place before you could pick it up. It began to occur to me along the way that if we had a place on the planet where we could go back and revisit that era, not by the myths that we made up about it. You know, none of that greatest generation stuff or today's American exceptionalism. But if we could go back and revisit that era in truth, as it was lived by those of us who lived it, what we could get is a baseline against which to measure how far we've come. But we have to know where we started. We have to know in order to find out how far we've come. And that became my reason for becoming a park ranger at the age of 85. Because that history was so important and so forgotten. It is so important that today's generations know. Because we still have a long way to go. But we have to know, and in knowing is the hope for the future. And I like to end my talks giving you my personal history, which is rather remarkable. If only because it was lived by so many. It's not mine alone. But my great-grandmother, Leontine Bro Allen, was born into slavery in 1846 in St. James Parish, Louisiana. Enslaved until she was 19, at which time she was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, and married George Allen, who was a corporal in the Louisiana State Colored Troops, fighting on the side of the North in the Civil War. Together over time, they brought into the world 13 children in their home in St. James Parish. My mother was born to their eldest son, George, and his 14-year-old wife, who only lived until my mother was 7 months old. But my great-grandmother lived to be 102, dying in 1948, 3 years after my experience in that Jim Crow Union Hall. My mother was born in 1894 and died at 101 in 1995, and I was born in 1921 and will celebrate my 95th birthday in another 10 days. And that means that the three of us were all adults at the same time. That I was 27 years old, married and a mother, by the time my slave ancestor died. I knew her as a matriarch of my family. And all of that American history, from the Dred Scott decision, the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction, Plessy v. Ferguson, Sacco and Vanzetti, Rosenberg's, Lindbergh's flight, Amelia Earhart's loss, the First World War, all the way to Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Fannie Lou Hamer and Emmett Till and House Un-American Activities Committee and Kent State, People's Park, to September 11th and Occupy, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, 20 kids in a Connecticut classroom and 14 in San Bernardino, 9 people in a prayer circle, North Carolina, in Orlando, Florida. All of that happened within the lifetime of 3 women who were adults at the same time, and add to that the fact that on January 20th of 2009, I'm a seated guest on the Capitol Mall, guest of George Miller, my representative, with a picture of my great-grandmother in my breast pocket, witnessing the inauguration of America's first African-American president. In the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, Lincoln, whose life was contemporary with the life of my great-grandmother. That's how fast the time goes. If that doesn't blow your mind, check your pulse. because that's how fast the time goes. I know how my generation met the threat of its day, and it was a very real threat of fascist world domination, and I know that we did that under a severely flawed social system. But we nonetheless prevailed. And our children and our grandchildren, and some of you in this room, are now facing a new threat. The threat of fascist domination may be past, but the threat of rising sea levels, global warming, climate change, are with us now. And they will have to, you will have to, match and exceed that great mobilization in order to save the planet. And you're going to do it under a still flawed social system. Because the nature of democracy is it will never stay fixed. It wasn't intended to. We have a constitutionally protected right to be wrong, protected right to be bigots. We also have this incredible system of national parks where it is now possible for us to revisit almost any era in our history. The scenic wonders, the contemplative places, the heroic places, the shameful places, and the painful places. In order to own that history, that we may process that history, in order to move into a more compassionate future together. And that's what the national parks has come to mean for me. There's a place on the film where Agnes Moore, a Rosie, still living, says, "It was the greatest coming together of the American people that I have ever lived through." And when she first used to say that, when I would stand against the wall watching the faces of the audience watching the film, and I would hear her say that, and I'd think, how can she say that? I mean, come on, Agnes, that's crazy. That's not true. And somewhere around my 90th birthday, I aged into a place where the concept of conflicting truths dawned on me. And I realized that we all create our own reality. And that there are many, many truths. And that many of them are in conflict. But this is not an either-or world. It is both and. And I wish I'd known that when I was a 14-year-old. But that's what the park has come to mean to me. The place where those conflicting truths can coexist. So thank you very much for coming. I thank you very much. Are there any questions?
My question has to do with what you think is the greatest migration of people coming together. Given that there are these different realities, I'm just curious.
I didn't understand.
So you talked about Rosie the Riveter saying this was the greatest migration of people coming together.
Yes.
So I'd like to know what you think is, for you, your own personal reality, what is that greatest migration for you?
I think that coming together was not an aware coming together. We came together out of an emergency. And we did it under a completely broken social system. So it is remembered in different ways by different blocks of people. It is nostalgic for the Rosies. It is the proudest day that some women that I work with can look back on. And it is not that for the coming together does not represent for that for me at all. Because I grew up in California. I grew up as a second-generation Californian, not as an African American. And because that was true, I wasn't equipped for the Great Migration that came in, because inadvertently, Henry Kaiser imported the entire system of racial segregation along with those people. And I was in a world that I'd not grown up in without leaving home. And so the coming together has mixed messages for me. I think that maybe that will always be I think people come together in different configurations at different times.
You shared such great stories and personal recollections of sort of, every generation we have challenges, and you hit on that at the end. With all the experience that you have and through the life that you've lived, how do you think? Do you think we? What are our shots in the future? Do you think we'll be able to rise to these new challenges from what
I
you've
think
seen?
that every generation has to recreate democracy in its time, because it's a participatory form of governance that requires all of us. And the 39% turnout in the last general election does not bode well for our ability to even sustain ourselves as a nation. The ways in which I am glad that my time is coming to an end, because I have no idea what you guys are going to do. And we are leaving behind a mess. But it is true that the power to recreate democracy is with you. When I was in grammar school, or even in middle school, I really believed that the Constitution with the Bill of Rights was an entitlement that came with me at birth. And my outrage in the 60s as an African-American activist was based on that belief that this is my rights and you cannot take it away from me. And I somehow evolved into a place where I now see them as not deeds at all or entitlements, but as blueprints with which every generation has to recreate democracy. That's all they are. They were dreams and visions of the Founding Fathers. And each generation has to reshape it, and that the tools for reshaping it lie in those founding documents. And that's something that I couldn't have known, I think, when I was even 75. That's come in with recently acquired knowledge. I now see myself as an evolving person in an evolving nation, in an evolving universe. That I couldn't have said when I was 75.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for inviting me.